This is I Hear Things for April 25th, 2021. The one thing podcasters must do to prepare for paid podcast subscriptions. That's a lot of plosives. Man, I hope my pop filter is working today. We'll figure that out. So Apple Podcasts has finally unveiled its paid podcasting layer. And so now you can ask people to subscribe to your show like a boss. Apple will take a 30% cut of your subscription revenues, which will decrease to 15% after a year. And for more on this, I encourage you to check out Pod News from the past week, especially Wednesday and Thursday. James Cridlin aggregated a lot of great takes and informational pieces on the whole debacle, so you can read up on it for yourself. Apple used to be by far the number one place to get podcasts, but today Spotify and YouTube have really grown their own audiences, and often those are new audiences to podcasting itself, certainly enough for there to be a big three in podcasting at least. This move by Apple is certainly going to get us talking about them again as a preeminent force in podcasting, and I know there have been some hiccups in the road. I saw a Twitter thread from Transistor FM's founder Justin Jackson. He had some issues getting some of his content up there, and some of it disappeared, I know, for James Cridlin. But it's going to get straightened out, and many podcasters are going to be thinking about diving into the great black box that is the paywall of Apple. Now, if you're currently making no dollars, and Apple is giving you a way to make more than no dollars, it might seem like an easy choice. But I can assure you that it's far from an easy choice. Unlike using services like Patreon, which, by the way, just raised a bunch of money just to prepare for this eventuality, when you're using Apple's paywall, you're really ceding any other contact with your audience over to Apple. You don't get email addresses. You don't really get any way to reach out to your audience other than to send them your subscription podcast. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here on a spicy hot take about this. I can't really advise you what to do without spending a lot more time with your individual situation. I can only say that most podcasters should not lock their content away in this matter. And you might say, Tom, NPR is doing this. Well, yes and no. They're making use of the subscription layer, to be sure. So here is my step-by-step plan to replicating Apple and NPR's model. Step 1, already be NPR. Step 2, do what NPR is doing. That part is simple. NPR can do this because they already have a massive audience, and that audience is accustomed to direct support of NPR programming. And NPR isn't making that content exclusive. You're still going to be able to get it. It's just another easy way for people who are already supporting or are predisposed to support NPR programming to do so. They're facilitating an existing behavior. They're not trying to create a new one. So it's hard to do two things at once when you're building a media brand. Do you want to build your audience right now? Or do you want to monetize your audience right now? If it's the latter, if it's monetizing, then you already need a sizable audience. You need enough of an audience to monetize. If it's the former, to build an audience, well, charging for your content is a great way to disappear from the public eye. If you want to grow an audience in podcasting, you need to be leading with your best content and making that content available as widely as you possibly can. Now, I wrote about exclusive content a couple of weeks ago in my I Hear Things newsletter. It's rarely effective in podcasting. Now, rare is not never, but rare is rare. Luminary tried to do both, right? They tried to attract a new audience and monetize that audience from scratch all at the same time, and it's really, really hard to do. Now, a lot's been written about the import of Apple's move for creators, but my job is and always has been about audiences. And it's worth thinking about all of this from the audience perspective, too. For those who use the Apple Podcasts app, well, their experience is going to change. The content in the app is going to be divided into two camps: the content Apple makes money from and the content they don't. Those campgrounds, I'm going to bet, are going to end up looking a little bit different to each other. There's going to be some confusion, I think. Now that podcast subscriptions actually are something you have to pay for, if you're not charging, then you're really going to have to over-communicate the term follow. Now, you may fully understand what Apple is doing here because it's in your best interest to do so as a content creator. But your listeners, they don't. And they won't. They're not going to care about any of that. They're going to need to know the one simple thing to do, the one thing you want them to do. You can't rely on Apple getting this right for your listeners. I mean, they probably will. They're good at this stuff. But guiding an audience to the best experience of your podcast, that's your responsibility and not Apple's. Now, I'll wrap this up by suggesting the most important thing you can be doing right now, and you're probably not doing it. The most important thing a creator can be doing to prepare for Apple paid podcast subscriptions and Spotify when that happens. Build your email list. Monetizing through Apple is fine, but Apple controls access to that part of your audience, right? Spotify is going to do the same. Now, you may have an audience on YouTube, but what do you do with them, right, if you're charging for your content elsewhere? Having your audience A, split across multiple platforms, B, experiencing your show differently on those platforms, and C, not accessible to you in a unified manner. It's going to be really difficult for you to tie all that together. Yugoslavia couldn't do it, and likely neither can you. I talked to podcast network executives and the producers of some of the medium's biggest shows, and many of them don't have an email list for their shows either, so don't feel bad if you haven't done this yet. But the only way to keep your wits about you in the increasing balkanization of podcasting is to control at least one unified point of access. For me, that's my newsletter. I've built my newsletter first, before this show. You should have as many points of distribution for your podcast as possible. You should be everywhere. I don't care where they listen, as long as they do. But distribution is not access. Access is a different dog. Here's my last thought on this, and I hate to say it, but this fully puts the word free back into play when you're talking about your podcast. Second topic I want to tackle this week is how I'd spend that sweet, sweet Clubhouse money. So Clubhouse just got another infusion of venture capital, one that values the service at $4 billion. Now, I'll remind you that Clubhouse is not worth $4 billion until someone buys them for $4 billion. So I'm not going to get worked up about an outsized valuation. But now that they've got some cash, well, what should they do with it? Well, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, my job is and always has been about the audience. Where to find an audience, what do they want, what don't they want, and how not to lose them. In that spirit, I decided to spend some time experiencing Clubhouse as an audience member and not as a moderator or a speaker. So for the last month or so, with a couple of very tiny exceptions, I've resisted the urge to hop on that virtual stage, and I've hung back and experienced Clubhouse as a consumer, as an audience member, and not as any kind of a creator. That said, my experience as a consumer it's a little different than yours. I spent nearly a decade of my early career doing all of these dial tests of audio and video programming with audiences. Now, if you've ever watched political debate or something like that on CNN, and you've seen these EKG lines going across the screen with a focus group using these wireless dials to crank the dial up if they like what the politician has to say and crank it down if they don't. That's what I'm talking about here. I've done a crap ton of those, hundreds. I've done them for some of the biggest and best syndicated shows in the world, and I've also done them for some of the worst shows in the world. In fact, I've done this kind of testing so much in my life that dial test going poorly is an actual honest-to-God nightmare that I sometimes have in my sleep, as my wife can verify. The upshot of all of this is that while other people may have superpowers that benefit humanity in some way, my superpower is to see these lines in the space in front of me anytime I listen to content. I see them go up, and I see them go down. I can't shake them. It's as useless a superpower as being able to shoot cotton balls from your eyes. So I'm not going to be asked to join the Justice League, and I've made my peace with this. And let me tell you this. When I listen to Clubhouse, I see the lines going down, way down, all the time. I have friends that argue with me about this, but those friends are generally speaking or they're moderating rooms. And I'll tell you, speaking on Clubhouse It's fun if you like that kind of thing. Being on stage and moderating and speaking is engaging, but that experience is very atypical. Most of us aren't speakers, and most of the time, there's nothing interesting on Clubhouse. That's really the central problem Clubhouse needs to throw a lot of its newfound VC money at. It doesn't matter what time of day I look at Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, there's something interesting on. Look at Clubhouse right now. There is nothing interesting on. Yeah, there was that cool thing you did there that one time, and maybe that popular room that you do on Saturdays. But right now, this instant, that thing is not there, and there are no things you want. Now, when people repeatedly check a site and see that nothing's on, they're going to stop repeatedly checking that site. Clubhouse is going to be under a lot of pressure to spend that sweet new VC money on getting their Android version out and then user acquisition. But if they don't solve the nothing's on when I look at it problem, it's not really going to matter. If I were an investor in Clubhouse, my fear would be that it's a lot easier for the platforms that are always interesting to add audio than it is for the audio-only platform to become always interesting. That's this week's episode of I Hear Things. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the show. Please follow the show. Don't subscribe to it. That would cost you money. Just follow it. Go to tomwebster.media, sign up for the I Hear Things newsletter, and you'll get an email about this show every single week. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.